Welcome to ND Love Story, where love stories are told with raw emotions and captivating storytelling. If you enjoy heartfelt and mesmerizing love stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to ND Love Story so you won't miss any episode. My name is Alexander, Alex Walker, and I was 25 when I began serving a 3-year sentence at Eastwood Correctional Facility for drug possession. I'd never been in trouble with the law before. But one mistake at a party led to another, and before I knew it, I was being processed into the state prison system. Officer Jared McKinley was the first guard I noticed during intake. He wasn't like the other corrections officers, who seemed to take pleasure in intimidating new inmates. Instead, he had a quiet professionalism about him and kind blue eyes that stood out against his stern expression. He couldn't have been more than 30, and his uniform fit him perfectly, highlighting his athletic build. "Walker," he called my name from the processing list, his voice deep but gentle. "Step forward." As he took my fingerprints, his touch was surprisingly careful. Our eyes met briefly, and something passed between us, a moment of recognition, perhaps, or understanding. He quickly looked away, continuing with the procedure. "You'll be in Block C," he said, handling my paperwork. "I work that block. Follow the rules, keep your head down, and you'll be fine." I nodded, trying not to focus on how his presence made my heart rate quicken. This was prison. After all, having feelings for a guard was about the worst idea possible. The first few weeks were rough. Prison life took some getting used to. And while I wasn't targeted, being relatively fit and able to handle myself helped. The environment was constantly tense. Officer McKinley's presence was one of the few comforting constants. He treated all inmates fairly. But I started noticing small things. How he'd pause slightly longer at my cell during counts. How his eyes would find mine in the yard. How he seemed to be around whenever I was headed to or from my job in the prison laundry. About a month into my sentence, I was sorting laundry when another inmate started hassling me, trying to pressure me into carrying contraband in the laundry carts. "Everything all right here, Walker?" Officer McKinley's voice cut through the tension. He'd appeared seemingly out of nowhere. "Just fine, officer," the other inmate mumbled, backing away. After he left, McKinley lingered. "You okay, Walker?" "Yes, sir, thank you." He lowered his voice. "If anyone gives you trouble, let me know. You don't seem like the type who belongs here." "Is there a type that belongs in prison, sir?" I asked before I could stop myself. To my surprise, he smiled slightly. "Fair point, just be careful." After that, he seemed to keep a closer eye on me. Sometimes, during night shifts when most inmates were asleep, he'd pause by my cell, and we'd talk quietly. Nothing inappropriate, just conversations about books, music, life before prison. He told me he'd joined corrections after 4 years in the Marines. That he had a degree in criminal justice. That he lived alone with his dog. I found myself looking forward to these brief interactions more than I should. There was something about Jared, as I'd begun thinking of him, that made me feel seen. As a person, not just an inmate number. One evening, about 3 months into my sentence, I was working late in the laundry room, a privilege I'd earned through good behavior. Jared came in for a routine check. "Still at it, Walker?" he asked, closing the door behind him. "Just finishing up, sir." I was folding the last batch of uniforms. He walked closer, ostensibly inspecting my work. "You're doing a good job here. I've noticed how you stay out of trouble. Keep to yourself." "Trying to make the best of my time," I said, aware of how close he was standing. "Alex," he said softly, using my first name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips made me shiver. I looked up, meeting his eyes. The professional mask he usually wore had slipped, and what I saw in his expression made my breath catch. "We shouldn't," he whispered, but he didn't move away. "I know," I replied, equally quiet. For a long moment, we stood there, the air between us charged with unspoken feelings. Then, somewhere in the distance, a door slammed, breaking the spell. Jared stepped back quickly, resuming his professional demeanor. "Finish up here and return to your cell," he said, his voice carefully neutral. But as he turned to leave, his hand brushed against mine, too deliberately to be accidental. That touch, brief as it was, haunted me for days. I'd lie awake at night in my cell, thinking about Jared's blue eyes. The way his voice softened when he said my name. The electricity I felt whenever he was near. I knew these feelings were dangerous. For both of us. but I couldn't stop them. A week later, I was mopping the hallway near the storage rooms when Jared appeared. He looked around quickly, then unlocked one of the doors. "Walker, I need help moving some supplies," he said loudly, for the benefit of anyone who might be listening. Once inside the dimly lit storage room, he closed the door. We stood in silence for a moment, hearts pounding. "This is insane," he muttered, running a hand through his short brown hair. "I could lose my job. You could get transferred or have time added to your sentence." "I know," I said softly. "I don't want to cause trouble for you." He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne. "You're all I think about," he confessed. This has never happened before. With an inmate." "I believe you," I whispered. His hand came up to cup my face, thumb brushing across my cheekbone. "Tell me to stop," he said hoarsely. Instead, I leaned into his touch. The next moment, his lips were on mine. Gentle at first, then increasingly urgent. I gripped his uniform shirt, pulling him closer as he backed me against the shelves. The kiss deepened, years of training and professionalism crumbling in the face of our mutual desire. A distant door slammed, and we jumped apart. Jared straightened his uniform, trying to steady his breathing. 10 minutes, he said. "Actually move some boxes around. Make it look legitimate." After that day, we found ourselves drawn into a dangerous dance. We had to be incredibly careful. One wrong move could destroy both our lives. But we managed to find moments, brief touches during counts, meaningful glances across the yard, carefully orchestrated meetings in storage rooms or empty corridors during night shifts. Jared was always professional in front of others. But when we were alone, he showed me a different side of himself. He was funny, passionate about criminal justice reform, and carried a deep sense of responsibility for the inmates under his care. "Sometimes I feel guilty," he admitted during one of our stolen moments. "Not just about us, but about this whole system. So many guys in here just need help, not punishment." "You're different," I told him. "You treat us like humans." He kissed me softly. "You make me want to be better at everything." But our relationship wasn't without its complications. One day, another inmate, Diaz, noticed Jared lingering too long at my cell during night count, getting pretty friendly with Officer McKinley. "Aren't you?" he sneered at me in the yard the next day. My heart raced, but I kept my face neutral. "Don't know what you're talking about. Maybe I should let the warden know what I've seen." Before I could respond, Jared appeared, having noticed the confrontation from his post. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying its usual professional authority. "No problem, officer," Diaz said with a meaningful smirk. "Just having a friendly chat with Walker here." That night, Jared came to my cell after lights out, his face tight with worry. "We need to be more careful. Diaz has been causing trouble for years. He'll use any leverage he can get." "Should we stop?" I asked, though the thought made my chest ache. He reached through the bars, taking my hand. "I don't think I can," he admitted, "but we need to be smarter." We became more cautious after that, but our feelings only grew stronger. Jared arranged to have me assigned to the library, where I could help organize and catalog books. It was quieter there, with fewer inmates and more legitimate reasons for a guard to check in regularly. One evening, while shelving books in the reference section, a secluded corner with no security cameras, Jared found me alone. "I got your note," he said softly, referring to the small piece of paper I'd slipped into a book he'd borrowed. I'd written just 3 words, "I miss you." He glanced around quickly before pulling me behind the tall shelves. His kiss was hungry, desperate, after days of maintaining our distance. My back pressed against the books as his hands roamed under my prison-issued shirt, touching bare skin. "God, Alex," he breathed against my neck. "You drive me crazy." I ran my fingers through his hair, something I rarely got to do. "I wish we could be together properly," I whispered. He pulled back slightly, his blue eyes intense. "When you get out," he started, then hesitated. "I've been thinking about transferring to a different facility," he said. "Once you're released, we wouldn't have to hide anymore." The thought made my heart race. "You'd do that?" He kissed me softly. In a heartbeat. Our moment was interrupted by footsteps approaching. Jared quickly stepped away, pretending to inspect the bookshelf as another guard walked past. The next few weeks were particularly challenging. Diaz had started watching us closely, and we had to be extremely careful. Our interactions were limited to professional exchanges and meaningful glances. with only rare moments of privacy. During this time, I learned more about Jared through our brief conversations. He'd grown up in a small town in Massachusetts, the son of a police officer. He joined the Marines right out of high school, serving 2 tours before coming home to study criminal justice. He'd been working at Eastwood for 5 years, gradually becoming disillusioned with the system but staying because he felt he could make a difference. "My father would kill me if he knew about us," he confided during one of our stolen moments. "He's old school, believes in strict boundaries between officers and inmates." "And what do you believe?" I asked. He traced my jaw with his finger. "I believe that love doesn't care about uniforms or prison walls." It was the first time either of us had indirectly referenced love, and it hung in the air between us, both thrilling and terrifying. Our careful routine was disrupted when a new guard, Officer Sterling, was assigned to our block. He was young and eager to prove himself, which made him dangerous. He started noticing things. How Jared always seemed to be around when I was working. How our eyes met across rooms. How he sometimes spoke in low voices when he thought no one was watching. One day, Sterling cornered me in the laundry room. "I know what's going on between you and McKinley," he said, his voice low and threatening. "The question is, what's it worth to you to keep it quiet?" My blood ran cold. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb," he sneered. "I want in on whatever contraband operation you got going. That's why McKinley's protecting you, right?" I almost laughed with relief. He thought Jared was helping me smuggle contraband. It was bad, but not as bad as the truth. "There's no operation," I said firmly. "Officer McKinley is just doing his job." Sterling grabbed my shirt, pushing me against the washing machine. "Don't lie to me, inmate. Is there a problem here?" Jared's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Sterling released me quickly. "Just having a chat with Walker about proper laundry procedures, sir." Jared's face was carefully blank, but I could see the anger in his eyes. "I'll take it from here. Sterling, the warden needs you in his office." After Sterling left, Jared checked to make sure we were alone. "Did he hurt you?" he asked, his hands gentle as they examined my neck where Sterling had grabbed my shirt. "I'm okay," I assured him, "but he's suspicious. He thinks you're helping me run contraband." Jared's jaw clenched. "Let me handle Sterling." "But, Alex," he looked at me seriously, "we need to be even more careful now." The Sterling situation added a new layer of stress to our already complicated relationship. Jared managed to get Sterling reassigned to a different block, but the incident had shaken us both. We became even more cautious, limiting our interactions to brief moments when we were absolutely certain we wouldn't be observed. Despite the increased risk, or perhaps because of it, our feelings continued to deepen. Every stolen glance, every brushing of hands during counts, every whispered word carried more weight. We began leaving each other secret messages. I would mark specific passages in library books, and he would respond by leaving tiny notes in predetermined hiding spots. One night, about 18 months into my sentence, Jared was working the graveyard shift. Most inmates were asleep, and the prison was as quiet as it ever got. He stopped at my cell during his rounds. "Alex," he whispered, "are you awake?" I moved to the bars. In the dim light, his face was half in shadow, but his eyes were bright. "I got approved for transfer," he said softly, "to Riverdale Correctional, about 2 hours from here. It'll happen in 6 months. My heart sank and soared simultaneously. A transfer meant we'd be separated, but it also meant we could have a real relationship once I was released. 6 months, I repeated. That's around when I'm eligible for parole. He reached through the bars, his fingers brushing mine. I've been thinking about that. With your record of good behavior. And if I put in a recommendation, you'd do that? I'd do anything for you. He whispered, but it has to be legitimate. You've earned it with your behavior and work in the library. We were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Jared quickly resumed his professional stance, continuing his rounds, but the hope he'd given me burned bright in my chest. The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. Jared helped me gather the necessary documentation for my parole hearing while carefully maintaining professional boundaries in front of others. Meanwhile, I threw myself into my work in the library, started a reading program for other inmates, and took every educational course available. But our careful plans were nearly derailed one evening when Diaz finally made his move. He approached me in the yard, a smug smile on his face. "Got something interesting to show the warden." he said, pulling out a crude phone made from smuggled parts. Been recording some interesting nighttime conversations between you and Officer McKinley. My blood turned to ice. What do you want? I want in on whatever deal you two have going. Must be something big for a guard to risk his career. Before I could respond, a fight broke out on the other side of the yard. As guards rushed to break it up, Diaz got caught in the chaos. In the scuffle, his illegal phone was discovered and confiscated. Later that night, Jared came to my cell. Diaz is in solitary, he whispered. They found 3 phones on him. He's facing additional charges for contraband. Did they find anything on the phones? They were all damaged in the fight, he said, relief evident in his voice. But, Alex, that was too close. He was right. We'd gotten careless, letting our feelings override our caution. We agreed to be more careful in our remaining time, limiting our contact to completely necessary interactions. The months leading up to my parole hearing were a delicate balance of demonstrating my rehabilitation while maintaining absolute discretion about my relationship with Jared. We communicated mainly through our book code system. I would check out specific books, and he would leave tiny notes tucked between specific pages. One such note read, 6 more weeks, then a year of waiting, then forever. I kept it hidden in my mattress, reading it on the nights when the separation felt unbearable. Jared had already started his transfer paperwork, timing it so he would leave shortly after my parole hearing. We'd worked out that if I was released, we would need to wait at least a year before having any contact, to avoid suspicion and comply with parole regulations. During this time, I learned that Jared had been quietly working to improve my chances. He documented my work in the library, my participation in educational programs, and my positive influence on other inmates. He did it all through proper channels, making sure everything was legitimate and above board. The parole hearing was intense. I sat before the board, answering their questions about my rehabilitation, my work with the library program, and my plans for the future. Jared was there, maintaining his professional demeanor as he detailed my contributions to the prison community. Officer McKinley, one board member asked, in your professional opinion, is Mr. Walker ready for reintegration into society? Mr. Walker has shown exceptional growth during his time here, Jared replied, his voice steady. He's not only reformed himself but has helped numerous other inmates through the reading program he established. I believe he would be more beneficial to society outside these walls than within them. 2 weeks later, I received the news. My parole had been granted. I would be released in 1 month. That night, Jared managed to find a moment alone with me in the library's reference section. This is our last real moment together for a while, he said softly, pulling me close. Once you're released, there will be restrictions on contact between us for at least a year. It's standard procedure for parolees and prison staff. A year, I repeated, my heart aching. That's a long time. He kissed me deeply, desperately. It's better than 3 years. And after that, he traced my jaw with his finger. After that, there's nothing stopping us from being together properly. The day of my release was surreal. I changed into civilian clothes, collected my few belongings, and went through the processing procedures. Jared was there, professional and distant, but his eyes said everything his words couldn't. Good luck, Mr. Walker, he said formally, shaking my hand. In that brief contact, he pressed something into my palm, a small piece of paper. Later, in the taxi taking me to the halfway house, I unfolded it. Inside was an email address and 3 words, wait for me. The next year was both easier and harder than my time in prison. I found a job at a small bookstore. Using the skills I gained in the prison library, I enrolled in community college classes, determined to make the most of my second chance. Jared and I couldn't communicate directly, but I followed his career through public records. He had successfully transferred to Riverdale Correctional and was implementing similar educational programs there. Sometimes, late at night, I would write him emails, saving them in my drafts folder but never sending them. I told him about my new life, my hopes, my fears, how much I missed him. On particularly hard days, I would reread his note, wait for me. Exactly 1 year and 1 day after my release. As I was closing up the bookstore, a familiar figure appeared at the door. Jared stood there, no longer in his guard uniform but in casual clothes, jeans and a blue button-down shirt that matched his eyes. For a moment, we just stared at each other. He looked different in civilian clothes. younger somehow, but his eyes were the same ones that had given me hope during those long prison nights. "Alex," he said softly, stepping inside. I locked the door behind him, turning the sign to closed. When I turned back, he was right there, pulling me into his arms. The kiss was different from our stolen moments in prison, unhurried, unafraid, full of promise. "I've been counting the days," he murmured against my lips. "Me too," I whispered back. "Every single one." We went to a small coffee shop a few blocks away. Somewhere public but quiet. It felt surreal to be sitting across from him at a normal table. Like regular people on a regular date. "I left corrections," he told me, stirring his coffee. "After implementing the education program at Riverdale, I realized I could do more good from the outside. I'm working with a nonprofit now, helping former inmates reintegrate into society." I smiled. "That suits you. You always wanted to make a real difference." He reached across the table, taking my hand. "You inspired that change. You know, seeing how the system worked, or didn't work, through your eyes. It changed my perspective on everything." We talked for hours, catching up on the year we'd missed. I told him about my job at the bookstore, my college classes, my plans to major in library science. He told me about his new work, his apartment in the city, his hopes for the future. "I bought a house," he said eventually. "Well, I'm in the process of buying one. It's about halfway between here and where I work. It has a library room." My heart skipped. "Jared, I'm not asking you to move in right away," he said quickly. "I know we need time to get to know each other properly, outside of everything else, but I want you to know that's where I see this going, us together, building a life." I squeezed his hand. "I'd like that." We took things slowly after that, dating like a normal couple. We went to movies, had dinner with friends, spent weekends exploring the city. Sometimes we'd talk about our time in prison, processing the complexity of how we'd met and fallen in love, but mostly we focused on building our future. 6 months later, I moved into the house with Jared. The library room became our favorite space, filled with books we both loved. Sometimes, late at night, we'd sit there reading together, and I'd think about how far we'd come from those whispered conversations through cell bars. One evening as we sat in our library, Jared handed me a book, the same edition I'd first left a note in for him at the prison library. "Open it," he said softly. Inside, on the title page, he'd written, "To new chapters and happy endings. Marry me?" Looking up at him through tears, I saw the same kind blue eyes that had first given me hope in my darkest place. The same love that had transcended walls and rules and time. "Yes," I whispered, pulling him close. 1,000 times yes. Our story wasn't conventional. It began in a place of confinement and constraint, but it blossomed into something beautiful and free. We had overcome every obstacle, social stigma, legal restrictions, our own fears, to build a life together. As I lay in bed that night, Jared's arm around me, I thought about how sometimes the most unexpected circumstances can lead to the most profound love. Our relationship had started in shadows, but now we were living in the light, writing our own story, one page at a time. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that while our beginning might have been unconventional, our ending was exactly as it should be, together, free, and deeply, irrevocably in love.